Engrossed in what she was seeing, Moore stared at the screen in front of her, while James's eyes seemingly stared back at her out of the broadcast of the speech he was giving. What he said was concerning, but she didn't really have her mind to focus on that right now because her mind was still hanging on to the gruesome deeds that had been committed against him during his containment. Nervously, her claws combed through the fur on her neck, although she had to be careful to not get them tangled in the parts that had been braided by the humans. With one last intense stare at the camera, James's speech seemed to be over, and the broadcast cut away to a very different human, sitting behind a desk in front of a bright blue background, and reading out something from a sheet of paper in their hand in a language Moore did not understand, with a professional and unmoved demeanour. Moore took a breath, and looked at the screen for a bit longer before tearing her eyes away by closing them for a few moments, trying to order her thoughts on the matter. Strange. A familiar voice suddenly rang out behind her, sending a prickly feeling all throughout her body as her old heart lost its rhythm for a brief moment, while recognition set in. I imagine they cut out a lot more of that, to be honest. Quickly, she swung her large head around, tilting it to the side until one of her eyes finally landed on the small figure that had seemingly appeared out of nowhere right behind her. "James!" Moore mumbled, her voice having nearly no force behind it. For a moment she studied the young human. He was dressed again, wearing the same uniform as most humans on board of the military vessel she had seen so far, just as he had done on the recording she had just seen. And while he looked nowhere near as bad now as he had on the broadcasts they had seen of him back when he was still being held in hostage, the signs of exhaustion and fatigue were still quite noticeable on him. The dark bags under his eyes were as intense as they had ever been, and he carried himself with a certain toil to his movements that Moore wouldn't expect of someone of his age. And of course his arm was back, or more precisely it had been replaced. The appendage was completely concealed by his sleeve and a glove, yet he still oriented it towards his back, seemingly trying to somewhat hide it behind his body, without making it too obvious that he was trying to do so. "Hey, Moore," James replied, and awkwardly stepped on the spot while looking up at her. And although he was smiling, his gaze felt weary and hesitant, as he was clearly seeming to be anticipating something. Whatever that was, she was not sure, but it was obvious that he wouldn't take the first step towards her. However, it was a burden she would all too gladly carry for him, as she laboriously turned her massive body around and took large strides towards the young man, lowering her upper body down somewhat to his level, while he spreading her arms. A small weight seemingly fell off James's shoulder, as he visibly relaxed, although his posture still remained like that of one carrying a heavy load, just one that was ever so slightly less heavy now. James gladly allowed her to wrap her long arms around him, nesting his face into the fur of her left arm, and reaching up his left hand to gently stroke along it, and she could feel his fingers glide along singular locks of hair. He didn't speak at first, and neither did Moore. "It is good to have you back in safety," she finally warmly stated, as he slowly started to peel away from her again. "It is good to be back," James replied with a brief, awkward chuckle. Moore did not miss him immediately turning back to half hiding his new replacement arm behind his back, as soon as they had stepped a bit away from each other. Although she admittedly couldn't quite help but be slightly put off by the unnatural appendage, she didn't want him to feel like that was a measure necessary for her comfort, but she also felt like bringing it up directly could be opening a healing wound once again. "How are you feeling?" she asked instead, if only to feel the dead air that threatened to come up in the exchange. James's smile got a bit wider for a moment, as he let out a brief breath through his nose. "Been asked that a lot lately," he mused, and averted his eyes for a second, and Moore made a brief, amused sound. She could imagine that question coming up a lot in his situation. However, James seemed to quickly misinterpret her response as possibly depreciatory, and he hastily rushed to add, "But all in all, I'm fine. I really am. At least given the circumstances." He seemed to be in a bit too much of a hurry to reinforce his statement. However, that may very well have been because of the constant presence of one and the same question as well. "That is good to hear," Moore replied. "And how have you been?" James now inquired back, looking up at her with earnest interest, while he also seemed quite eager to not be talking about himself. "Are you adjusting all right to everything?" Moore amusedly breathed out through her nose. "Reasonably well, I presume," she replied joyfully, lifting herself up to show off both of the braids that had been woven into her fur, as well as the large blanket that had been knitted for her by some of the humans back in the Salem. "While I admittedly still do struggle with the changes of norms around me, humans seem to take to me like bugs to all fruit. I could barely save myself from their affection ever since we arrived with them. I presume it has made the transition much easier than it would have been otherwise." James took a second to study her new appearance more closely, even going so far as to physically shift his body and head, as the range of his eyes alone seemed to not be enough to get the full picture he wanted. "Glad to hear you got an earthly welcome," he finally concluded. "And I love the new look. Washes away at least a uniform year." "It does not suit you trying to be a charmer, James," Moore quite soberly informed him, before succumbing to a slight giggle at the clumsy attempt at flattery. "You may want to keep your attention directed towards you adored." James also chuckled, but averted his gaze for a noticeable second, before lifting it again to engage in more vapid talk of nothing for the time being. They used it to catch each other up on the details that were missing from their time spent apart, although admittedly Moore did most of the catching up. This is both because she had already heard a large part of James's story in the broadcast, and because it didn't seem like James was quite ready to recount in detail what had happened, which could have been for a multitude of reasons. "I have also gotten to know your lovely mother in the meantime," Moore finally informed him after a while, and she wasn't quite sure when was the last time she had sounded as sarcastic in a statement as she did now. James slightly flinched and briefly chortled. "Sorry," was all he had to say to that, which admittedly also made Moore chuckle. "I would say it is hard to believe that you two are related, if it was not written so clearly all over her face," Moore continued, and crossed her long arms with a disapproving shake of her head. "I have been told our similarities come out whenever we're not being polite," James commented self-reflectingly, and scratched at his cheek with his left hand. "What does she want from you?" But Moore waved him off with a deep breath. "The usual," she replied. "My allegiances, my citizenship, my experiences with you in these past instances, what my plans are going forwards, and so on and so forth. Incidentally, she asked about very few of the things I feel a mother should be curious and worried about in her position." Moore thought of her own children. How she would feel had something like this happened to one of them, and how she would act were she in a position to parent such circumstances. She could hardly formulate the thought, because it was hard to bear imagining her child being taken and maimed too vividly. However, she was quite sure that she wouldn't react anywhere close to how Sophia Krieger had acted towards her. "I'll be completely fair to her and assume that she wasn't talking to you as my mother during your conversation," James mumbled, apparently trying his best to stay placatory, despite his own known dislike of the woman that brought him into this world. It likely had something to do with them currently being on a ship that was currently under his mother's command, or maybe he just wanted to try and keep Moore from becoming too agitated. "For that, she made it surprisingly clear just who she was," Moore commented, getting one last footnote in before dropping the topic for the time being. Yeah, James conceded. It spoke for him that he tried to at least be fair, even if it seemed to be against his better, or maybe just his personal judgment. It caused a bit of an awkward silence between the two, as they had both decided to drop the topic, but had not yet come up with something else to follow it up with. Deciding to use the already slightly weary atmosphere, Moore felt that it would now be appropriate to stir the conversation, at least slightly, back to James's side of things. "And you are actually thinking of becoming a councilman?" Moore asked, with respect to the previous speech. James smacked his lips and seemed to mull over his answer for a second. "Well, so far I've only allowed people to still put their crosses next to my name in the election," he then explained, and absentmindedly scratched the tip of his boot across the floor. "I'll have to think about it a lot more once we know whether or not the council is being reinstated this time, and I'm sure the Human government is going to have plenty to say on the matter quite soon as well. But, at least for now, I'm not against it. Not that I ever wanted to be a politician, but this is quite the unique opportunity, and I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't at least consider it." "Is it an opportunity?" Moore asked empathetically. "It seems more like a burden to me." "Maybe it is, I don't know," James said, and defensively shook his head, squeezing his eyes tightly shut for a moment before returning his gaze up to her. "If it turns out to be a waste of time, I can always drop out later. Luckily, you still get asked if you actually accept your new position, even if you get elected into it." He clearly tried to deflect the direction the conversation was taking, and Moore was unsure on whether she should let him. After all, he had been through quite a lot already. Maybe it was best to just leave him be for now. But it seemed that James wouldn't let her reach her own conclusion on the matter, as he suddenly and quickly glanced up at the time displayed on the clock integrated into one of the room's walls, like it was standard with near every room at a starship. Behaving like he was surprised at the amount of time that had passed for a second, he suddenly piped up again, asking, "Say, do you by chance know where Conglorch is? I heard that he's around as well, and wanted to also catch up with him while I still have some time." Moore blinked in surprise for a moment. I looked down at him at mild concern. "Will you soon not have free time anymore?" she asked, trying to sound interested rather than worried about that supposed revelation. But luckily, James just smiled and shook his head. "Just some medical appointments later," he explained in seeming relaxation. "There's still some stuff to be resolved after my time in Ostringer. It's going to take a while until they fully declare me all better. And afterwards I wanted to turn in early tonight. I could really use some sleep. Relieved, Moore nodded at him. I do not know where exactly he is, she informed James, but I am sure the crew of the ship will be able to help you find him. He is very hard to miss, after all. James smiled up at her. We'll talk more as soon as I'm not seeing hazes around my vision anymore, he said, and demonstratively yawned while walking away from her and waving goodbye with his still organic arm. I am looking forward to it, Moore replied, and also waved, her fur shaking around harmoniously with the movement. Rest well, James. That same night, after finishing hours of work of what was just the beginning of the very long-winded process of possibly joining the human military from her current position as a refugee, she just slowly and exhaustingly made her way back to her room. There she found James, already fast asleep. As James had not yet had time to become attached to the room that was assigned to him for his time in the sun, they had decided that he would just start sleeping in her room. It was a pretty in-the-moment kind of decision, and neither of them had really thought through the implications of it, or if they were even ready to commit to sharing a room again, after everything that had happened in the meantime. Of course, Shida was aware that it would definitely end in disaster to pretend like these very real questions just weren't there, but that wasn't what they were trying to do. For now, they had simply moved into a later point in time, as neither of them had felt the desire to not be with the other that night. Still, while that was what they told themselves, plans were all nice and well, but they only meant anything if they would actually follow up on them, and it remained to be seen if they would. For now, the wish to pretend that all was well now, if only for a moment, was too alluring to ignore, and so Sheila just sleepily crawled into the bed next to James, who had even refrained from rolling himself up into the blanket cocoon for her sake, so she could nestle up right beside him without the risk of staying cold. And indeed, it was warm under the covers. Despite everything, it was still warm and inviting, and she wrapped her arms around him before being lulled to sleep by the slow rising and falling of his chest. In the sun assault of pure sensory overload, consisting of both light and sound, Sheila was suddenly ripped from her cozy sleep and shot straight off on the bed, disoriented by the blinding light and deafening noise. Next to her, James had a quite similar reaction of startling awake, although he didn't seem to be quite so high alert as she was. Slowly and clearly still half asleep, he lazily pushed himself up with his right arm, while rubbing his eyes with his left. For Sheila, it only slowly started to clear up what had suddenly happened. Somebody had opened the room's door, allowing the bright light from the hallway to shine right onto them, while also bringing some obnoxiously loud noise with them. She couldn't make out who it was right now, as the light transformed their form into a darkened silhouette. Good morning, a calm, high voice now greeted from the tall, slender figure. Morning, Athena, James replied with a slightly hoarse voice while still rubbing his eyes. Apparently he had recognized the voice. Stop calling me that, the voice replied with an exasperated sigh, as the black-tailed figure slowly became less and less hazy as Sheeta's eyes got used to the new lighting conditions. Or do you want me to make you call me Captain Anderson from now on? This Athena, or Captain Anderson, or whatever she was actually called, was a tall, athletic-looking woman, whose long blonde hair was bound into a tight ponytail. Her skin was about as pale as that of James, which wasn't exactly helped by her, of course, wearing the black military uniform that was standard on the ship. James dryly chuckled and pushed himself up even further, scooting into a sitting position. Well, I'll stop as soon as you stop calling me Buzz, he retorted, while Sheeta also started to get into a more dignified position than recently startled awake, whose name was Aldrin, by the way, not Aldwin. Already, it sounded like a discussion those two had many times, but were still not yet tired of having, leading Sheeta to believe that they were more than just passively familiar with each other. Maybe it had even turned into a sort of running joke between them at some point. It certainly sounded like that was a possibility. Who cares about one letter difference, when you could have been a Krieger instead? The blonde lady replied, crossing her arms and lifting the corner of her mouth into an implied smile, and the tone made it seem like that may as well be the punchline to the joke, although Sheeta didn't really see the humour in it. Oh, spare me, James groaned, and threw the covers off his legs, scooting around to let them dangle over the side of the bed. He then briefly interrupted his conversation with the strange visitor, turning his upper body around to look back at Sheeta instead, and once she looked back at him, he leaned in to press his forehead against hers for a moment, in an imitation of the greeting they had developed with each other back before they were separated. He even made his imitation of a chuffing sound, although it sounded like he was out of practice, making the noise come out almost uncanny. Still, Sheeta repeated it back at him, which immediately brought a wider smile to his face. However, it seemed the display was displeasing to their living along log, and she made an adverse sound, and Sheeta could see her seemingly roll her eyes in the corner of her vision. James seemed to have noticed it as well, because he immediately jumped on it, saying, "Oh, don't give me that. You're the one interrupting us. Besides, why are you here anyway?" That was a good question. Shada also didn't entirely appreciate being woken up in such a manner, so an explanation would be very welcome. "The captain?" The captain rolled her eyes again and now started to slowly take some last strides over towards the bed. "Well, knowing you, I expect you'd have trouble getting your rhythm back now that you're in the force once again. So I graciously decided to get up a bit earlier to give you a wake-up call," she explained, as she arrived at the foot of the bed. It was also the first time she spared more than a glance towards Shada, as the woman's cold blue eyes scanned over her for a moment. "Sorry to wake you up as well, but it's damn near impossible to get Buzz out of bed by gentle means." Then her head snapped back around to look at James, the ponytail emphasizing the sharp movement by following after her head with a slight delay. "Now get up already. You'll need to get into shape one way or the other, so we can't have you miss training, even if you have to take it easy," she commanded strictly. "I'm not in a combat role," James countered, but started to comply anyway, pushing himself off the mattress into his feet. Only now, seeing them next to each other, it became clear how tall the woman actually was, as James only exceeded her a slight bit in height. So far, she was the first human woman who Shada had seen get anywhere near that tall. "That's no excuse to be slacking," she informed James, and took another step towards him, where she briefly tapped against his shoulder with the back of her hand, before turning around and flouncing back towards the door. "I'll see you there, and you better not be late." And with that, she left, shutting the door behind her once more and leaving Shada to stare after her, while James began to sluggishly pull the clothes he had slept in off of him. Shada waited until he had freed himself from the shirt he had pulled over his head, before she asked, "So, who was that?" James started to fold the crinkly shirt, making Shada shudder in the cold air of the human ship, as she watched him stand around topless, seemingly not minding the temperature at all. "That was Athena, an old teammate of mine," he explained, hanging the now folded shirt over his right arm, while Shada wrapped the blanket tighter around her to stave off the cold. She lifted an ear curiously and slightly tilted her head. "She didn't seem to think she's Athena," she commented impishly, wondering if she could get the story out of him without prying too much. Her tail tried to eagerly wave around, but was constrained by the massive blanket around her, and therefore just uselessly wiggled in place. James chuckled. "Well, her actual name is Captain Samantha Anderson," he explained. "Or Sam for short, but the rest is true. She really is an old teammate of mine, just like Admir." Shada just kept looking at him expectantly, not yet satisfied with that answer. James seemed to be confused about that, stopping for a moment and lifting a single eyebrow at her, while apparently trying to figure out what more she wanted from him. "What?" he asked, before his brain apparently answered the question itself, and he looked up understandingly. "Oh, you're wondering about the nicknames, right?" He laughed to himself for a moment, and shook his head before he continued. "Well, there's not too much to it, really. She was quite insufferable back in the day, and just started calling me Buzz for quite petty reasons that are hard to explain. I, being just as petty, started calling her Athena in turn. And although we worked it out, none of us wants to be the first one to stop, so we're just going with it for now." Well, there was at least an explanation. Given earlier context clues, it seemed that Buzz was somehow alluding to James's last name in a way that probably made sense to humans, more so than to anyone else. That just left the question, but why Athena? James had started walking over to the bathroom with a fresh set of training clothes in the meantime, but stopped for a second while facing the door. "Well, it is very fitting," was all he had to say to that. Shortly after, he emerged again, washed up and changed. By then, Shada had also found it in her to get up, despite that meaning to expose herself to the cold air for some time, as she got properly dressed herself. James looked over and raised his eyebrows interestedly while watching her for a bit before saying, "All right, I'll be off then. I'd very much like to go without the constant scolding for being late." He brought his left hand to his temple, letting it slide off of it into a wave. While he did so, his right hand remained noticeably stuffed into his pocket. Shada wouldn't just let him off with her wave alone and went in for a hug instead, which James accepted, although only with his left hand, his right still remaining tucked away. "Should I maybe come along?" Shada asked, as soon as she had peeled away from James again, but he shook his head and waved the idea off. "I don't think human training is for you," he said with a tilted smile on his face, his eyes looking up into nothing as he seemingly imagined something before his inner eye. "It's mostly endurance based, since that's what we're made for. No offense, but I don't think you'll be able to keep up." Shada slightly lowered her ears. "Well, none taken," she replied. "I'm not arguing with facts. Besides, I'm better at other things." James nodded. "If you want to, I think you could hang around and watch, but I don't know how much good it'll do you," he added, seemingly not wanting to seem eager to exclude her. But Shada sighed and lowered her head. "No, go without me," she said, her ears hanging low in dreading anticipation. I still have plenty of paperwork to do after all. This is a good chance to not get distracted. James had a puzzling look on his face for a moment, as any expression seemed to fade away briefly before he snapped back to his previous disposition. All right, I better get going then, he said, and already started to be on his way before freezing his movement, while standing with his back. She'd got worried for a second and asked, "Everything okay?" while stepping up to him and reaching out for his shoulder. James exhaled, letting his shoulders sink slightly while simultaneously, gently, closing his hands into fists. "Yeah, it's all good," he said, reaching up and closed his hand around Sheeta's for a moment before gently removing it from his shoulder. "See you later. Love you." Sheeta's ears perked up, and she stood surprised for a moment as James continued his way towards the door, and a very brief flutter of warmth spread throughout her. But it quickly mellowed out again, which almost surprised her even more. Then again, it really wasn't news to her. It was still nice to hear it, though. And of course, there was only one way to reply. "Love you too." No matter its importance, paperwork had the tendency to be quite dull, but it didn't matter if it needed to be done. And Sheeta was determined to at least get the part of it she had put away for today done in a timely fashion. Although humans really had a strange fascination with bureaucracy, it seemed. Even back in Dumnia, when she had to organise everything from scratch to be able to leave the planet and join the military, it felt like she didn't need to fill out half as many forms as she did now, and this was only the beginning. At least she had a way better idea of what she was getting into this time, as well as some benefactors helping her along. Compared to back then, this would be a cakewalk. Still, it did feel a lot like it, working to leave one life behind to enter a new one. Hopefully it was a better decision this time. After all, last time it had led to a lot of unpleasant things, even if she was only slowly unravelling all that. She hadn't thought about what she left behind in a while. Mostly that was because her thoughts had been occupied with other things, like getting to safety herself and then trying to get James to safety. But admittedly, it could also have been that she avoided thinking about it, because there was a lot of baggage to unpack there, and she didn't quite know if she was ready for that. However, now that James was back and they had humanity backing them, it seemed like she had a moment to breathe, and in slower moving times, thoughts caught up to you easier. And Sheeta really wasn't sure how comfortable she was with that, because one of the first things that came up within her whenever she tried to think back was rage. And rage just wasn't a good emotion to have, she thought at least. Because after all, who was it that taught her that rage was bad? That it was dangerous? That especially she, of all people, should never rage? It had been the very same people that she was now feeling rage against, especially one man in particular. The same man who used to sit down with her and help her fill out paperwork just like this back when she was still green, even though he always went on about how much he hated paperwork. The man who had made most of the training and experience possible, that now even allowed her this opportunity she was working towards. The man that had seemingly taken her under his wing for so many years, and that had always been the one to turn to for her. But only until someone came along who actually understood her, or at least honestly tried to. Captain Newton had shaped her, there was no denying that. She had served for too long under him for anything else to be the case. He had trained her, he taught her how to fly, gave her an education, and he always instilled into her to show restraint, to look away from the prying eyes and pointing fingers, to block out the whispered words and hushed insults, to be the one to turn away should things get bad. She may not have always managed to follow it to a T, but she had still tried to live by it. And in the end, he had betrayed her. Actually, that was not entirely correct. To betray someone, you had to be on their side in the first place, but it had never been about her. She had never been someone in his eyes. She had only been an idea that he wanted to demonstrate to his peers, and that turned out to be wrong in the end. And like any wrong idea, she had been discarded. So maybe this rage that she felt wasn't as bad as she thought. She'd suddenly realised that she had stopped actually reading the words in front of her, and instead just let her eyes glide along the page without taking in any information. Reading back a bit, she found that she didn't even know where exactly she'd lost the thread. The last thing she remembered actually filling out was something about an enrolment to a language class, and while looking for it, she found that it was several pages back. She took a breath and closed her eyes tightly, scrunching up her face. Okay, maybe rage wasn't ideal for paperwork. I know I was delving in memories, and given the time she now had wasted already, maybe she should focus. No matter how dull the work, when you are engrossed in it, the time starts to fly by without being noticed, and Sheeta was now very engrossed in her work. So when she finally looked up and around her again, after finally fulfilling her self-imposed quota for the day, she wondered how many hours had passed already. Despite it feeling like an eternity while she actually did the work, it somehow simultaneously felt like it had not taken long at all afterwards. and James wasn't back yet? She knew that human training took longer than anything a Miat would endure on the daily, but it couldn't be this long, right? Especially since he still needed to take it easy for the moment. Not that she needed him to be around her constantly, or even most of the time. That sounded rather smothering, in fact. However, him not being there when she expected him felt odd. Of course, there were about as many things as stars in the galaxy that could have held him up somehow, so she wasn't exactly worried. But, as she had nothing better to do, she may as well try to go look for him. At least find out where he was. At least it would give her brain some stimulation after the dull work that had filled her day so far. She wondered where the training had been held. However, on a ship full of soldiers, it shouldn't have been hard to find out. And indeed, it seemed to be no secret to anybody, as every soldier she asked along the way helpfully pointed her in the right direction. It also seemed that the soldiers of the Sun were more direct and to the point than the ones she had met on the Salem, and really held themselves up with any interest in her. It could very well have been the fact that she was now walking around wearing the same uniform as the general soldier on board, even though it was currently lacking any indication of her rank, since she had none, and therefore any sign that she actually belonged to the Force, so nobody should reasonably mistake her for an actual soldier. She also mused for a moment if it was because of the quite different leaderships of the two vessels, as Admiral Krieger seemed to run her ship a good bit tighter than Commander Keown, which was probably necessary given just how much bigger it was. Whatever the reason, the people on board the Sun came a lot closer to the impression of the professional human soldier that James had given her whenever he had talked about them. Since she wasn't held up, she quickly reached the large area described to her by the soldiers that was apparently used for all kinds of exercises, although its current relative emptiness confirmed her suspicions that the training James had been called to earlier had long since ended. Some soldiers still remained in the room, apparently getting some extra exercise in during their own time or something of the sort. Shada hovered around the doorway for some time, thinking of her next move, and she didn't feel like randomly asking around for James in the hopes that somebody would know something. Maybe she would just go back to her room and relax, until he decided to show up on his own. However, suddenly she noticed someone approaching her and turned her head. A human man, slightly taller than her, with long hair and blood-red eyes that didn't look quite natural, approached her with a wide smile on his face. "Well, if it isn't the Sealer of Hearts," he commented, and his eyes seemed to hang on to Sheeta's ears for a second. "I was wondering when I'd get to meet you. Although you look a little lost, can I help you somehow?" Sealer of Hearts? Another one of James's old teammates? She ventured a wild guess, while scanning the man up and down. He was certainly older than James's old teammates she had met so far, having more lines on his face, especially around his eyes and mouth, but that didn't have to mean anything. "Almost right," the man replied with a nod, and extended his hand in a greeting. "I was actually his team leader, Major Andres Kojukaru, at your service." A major? Quite the achievement. Sheeta respectfully took his hand, and as he shook it, the man interestedly tilted his head, throwing his hair, that was bound into a tight ponytail, around in the process. "Sheeta," she introduced herself, "I'm, currently in the process of applying for a position." The man nodded and lifted a single eyebrow at her. "So I heard," he informed her, and let go of her hand. "Quite the undertaking in your position. Respectable. I'm looking forward to having you as a sister-in-arms." Sister-in-arms, sir? He sounded enthusiastic and polite, and it didn't seem like he was lying or just putting on a show, but it also didn't seem entirely earnest. "So, can I help you with something?" he asked once again, as his question was left unanswered before. Well, if anyone knew, it was probably him. "I'm looking for James, actually," she informed him, and looked around the vast amount of exercising equipment that was placed all around the largely open space in the middle of the room. All of the equipment seemed so small to her, although it was most likely perfect for someone her size. "Have you seen him by chance?" The major shook his head. "Not since the morning training, no," he replied, and scratched his temple, the smile on his mouth tilting to one side as he thought. "But I think he said he would go to a session afterwards, so maybe he's still there." "A session?" Sheeta asked. His ears standing up straight in curiosity. "Yeah, a therapy session," the major replied nonchalantly with a shrug of his shoulders. "Understandable after all he's been through." Sheeta paused, and her ears sunk down again. "He didn't say anything about therapy," she mumbled. "I wonder why he wouldn't bring something like that up with her." Apparently, the major immediately recognized the insecurities that he had stirred up, and he quickly raised a hand in a calming manner. "I wouldn't worry about that," he said, and he surprisingly sounded very sure about that. "He probably just forgot. Therapy and the Force go together like PB&J, by which I mean that they become an inseparable mess quite quickly. And sometimes we kind of forget that regular therapy sessions aren't in everyone's routine, so we forget to bring it up. Wouldn't surprise me if that happened to James. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time." That didn't sound super believable to her, and she also didn't remember James ever going to therapy back in the GES, But maybe the change of environment, as well as his recent return to active duty, had really brought back some old behaviours of his. Or maybe he just didn't feel like talking about it. That was well within his rights. At least the Major's words calmed her in so far that it seemed that seeking out therapy was not unusual or concerning for James. That part sounded the truest. And you regularly go to therapy as well? She inadvertently asked, while thinking about the practicality of that, her mouth speaking faster than her mind could stop it. Of course, she quickly realised that that was a rather personal question, and she immediately moved to apologise and take it back. However, the Major did not seem perturbed in the slightest, and pretty much immediately answered, "Yeah, I usually try to go at least once a month. When something's bothering me, I also go more regularly every now and then. Our insurance completely covers it, so why not make use of that?" Admittedly, this was the most casual Shida had ever heard someone talk about the topic. Not that she usually had a huge stigma against therapy or anything, but it still was something that she usually didn't discuss so openly. Mostly also because so far she hadn't exactly been the person people would willingly open up to about such topics, although now she felt like she remembered James talking about it in a similar way once before, even though the memory was quite hazy. "It really does help with dealing with stuff," the Major suddenly assured her. Shida nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm glad he's taking care of himself," she said. And it was just as much of a statement for the Major as it was a decision she made for herself at that moment. No matter if he told her or not, it was a good thing he was going. The Major now laughed out loud for the first time, and it emphasized the deep lines around his mouth even further as he did. "Yeah, he's smart kooky," he replied. "Well, most of the time." Then he looked Shida directly in the eyes, the wide smile slowly fading until only a friendly hint of it remained, that clashed wildly with his crimson irises. "So, do you want to go look for him, or?" he asked, seemingly genuinely curious and without an opinion on the matter either way. Well, if James had just begun to tell her, he would likely bring it up once he came back when explaining where he was, and if he just didn't want to talk about it, it really wasn't up to her to seek him out while he wanted some privacy. So she just shook her head, with her ears raised. "No, I think I'll just wait," she said, before looking around the gym once more, intrigued by the thought of distracting herself a bit. "But maybe I'll get some training in as well."